Recording, Samira. There
Yes,
it is.
I started
Okay.
click recording. Yeah.
Thank you for joining this session. After the first session we had last month about student engagement, this time we're going to focus our discussion on assessments in higher education. We have two great presenters today. We will start with Dr. Pete Boyd. He's an emeritus professor in education at the University of Cumbria and visiting professor of academic practice at the University of Hertfordshire. And then his talk will be followed by Stuart Norton, who's a senior consultant in advanced HE and principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. I'm going to shut up now and give the microphone to Pete. Pete, over to
Okay.
you. Feel free to share your slides,
Yeah,
and
sure.
you have about 20 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Well, welcome, colleagues, to this session. Thank you for your interest in this. And I'm going to share a few ideas about assessment and feedback in higher education. And my idea is to run through some ideas, some key concepts very quickly and briskly, and then hopefully leave a little bit of time for you to respond. So I'm interested in whether these key concepts that I will talk about, how they relate to your assessment and feedback practice, in the college. Okay. So I'm going to work quite quickly through the slides when I share them. But you can have some questions for me. And as well as the slides, I've just prepared the notes, really. So there's all the references and all the ideas will be circulated to you after the presentation. Okay, let's get started. I'll share my slides. Okay, so whenever I talk about something in education, like assessment and feedback, it's easy to slip into just the techniques of education. So I think it's important to just do a tiny bit of philosophy first. And so what I'd like to do in the first slide is consider the purposes of education, just to get a big picture before we get into the nitty-gritty of assessment and feedback. And Gert Biester proposes 3 domains of purpose. I mean, if you ask your students, I bet you they would say, I want to get a better job and I want to get paid more. So they're very focused on employability, but there's much more to education than that. So in the first domain, which Biester calls qualification, he puts knowledge. But I would say we should also remember that this should be epistemic. So they should learn ways of knowing. So they should learn, say, engineering knowledge, but also ways of knowing in engineering. How do we know? How do we know what we know? So ways of research, for example. In the second domain, Biester calls it socialization, and that's got employability in it, but it's also got family and citizenship. So my provocative question to you would be, how do your programs prepare students as global citizens? And the third area is Biester's, he developed the idea. It's fairly original. He developed it. Subjectification, he calls it. It means that education should allow you to develop as a unique human being. It shouldn't be so constraining, so tightly prescribed that it constrains you in your development. Okay. So a provocative question there would be, how much choice, how much freedom do students have to respond, say, to assessment tasks in a creative way, in their own personal interest way, or is it very tightly constrained? Okay, so that's my bit of philosophy to start the talk. Okay. And this idea, I'm sure you've come across it, constructive alignment. And, this idea is that the teaching activities, the assessment tasks and the learning outcomes are aligned. Now, the constructive word is important. What Biggs and Tang meant by that was, because you've aligned the assessment tasks with the learning outcomes and the teaching, then the student can construct meaning. So the constructive bit of constructive alignment means the student constructs meaning from your aligned setup here. Now then, my provocative question with that one would be, I wonder how tightly prescribed your learning outcomes are. Do you see that, in your validation, for example, processes, are you seeking really tightly constrained learning outcomes, tightly defined? Or is there a bit of space for students to respond in perhaps a more creative way to some of the assignments? Now, authentic assignment is what Stuart is going to talk about after me, so I won't go into too much depth on this one. But in professional fields like teacher education, my own field, or nurse education or engineering, it's likely that some of our assignments are fairly authentic. They are real world kind of activities that motivates the students to think that they're doing something that a real engineer would do. But they must have cognitive challenge because they're university level, they must challenge higher level thinking, otherwise they wouldn't be appropriate for university assessment. And then this third idea is that they should help the student to become, to understand what is good, say, engineering. And so by doing that, they're able to self-assess their own work. So I've no doubt that many of your assignments are reasonably authentic. But I wonder to what extent they are and whether they could be developed. And Stuart's session should help you consider that more closely. A big idea in grading, it's just something I work on with Advanced HE, is that there is variation in grading. Now, within your team, you might think that you can mark pretty closely. So one of you might grade something, 65, and someone else gives it 69, and you can have a, there's a reasonably close agreement on the marking. But the evidence is that there is variation, especially when you think you're not just grading your students, are you? When you give them a 2-1, the idea across the UK is that the value of that degree would be roughly comparable to another university. So it's not just grading variation within your own institution that matters. And that's why we have a system of external examining, for example. So the challenge there, I suppose, is with the variation in grading. Well, I wonder what kind of grader you are. Think of your background. What has influenced the way you grade student work? Are you the one who keeps the standards in the department? Are you the one that doesn't let standards slip? Or are you the one that sort of tries to be fair to the students and like to be a little bit generous where they need encouragement and so on? It's some of my research has shown that we have a kind of framework for ourselves, a kind of identity as a grader, and our background experience of education ourselves as a learner can influence the way we grade work. It's not as mathematical or scientific as we might think. It's more of a sociocultural challenge than a technical challenge, grading work correctly. And to help the students with their assessment, we use this idea of transparency, don't we? We have assessment guidance, we have written criteria, we have learning outcomes, we have maybe a grade descriptors and so on. The trouble is that all those words can be interpreted but in wildly different ways. Even tutors will disagree when they read an assessment criteria of what it actually means. So the only real way to develop an understanding of academic standards is to get a piece of student work and the assessment criteria or rubric and grade the work, and then have a discussion with your colleagues, tutor to tutor, or even with your students, and then have a discussion and eventually work towards consensus and come out with an understanding of a shared understanding of academic standards. And we call that shared understanding evaluative judgment. So what I'm saying is it's all very well having lots and lots of assessment guidance, but in the end, you'd have to do some practical work using some student exemplar or something like that. And you should be doing that with your students occasionally, say in year 1 and in year 2 of an undergraduate degree. But it's very valuable work to do as a team of tutors. So you'll have had all sorts of ideas probably in your practice about feedback, about your written feedback. But actually, one idea is to try and make feedback more dialogic. It tends to be monologic, doesn't it? If we're writing feedback on a student's piece of work, it tends to be a monologic transfer of information. So formative assessment is what has real learning power. By formative assessment, we mean the student gets an opportunity to do some work, then gets the feedback, and then gets the chance to amend and improve their work. Think of it like this. When you submit a research paper to a journal, you get peer review feedback, okay, and you get the chance to amend your paper and resubmit it for publication. And that's formative, okay? And the problem is that in universities in the UK, we put a lot of investment into summative assessment where the student might get some feedback, but the thing's over, right? They're likely to dismiss that feedback unless you work hard with them to make them apply it to their next assignment. So this is a real struggle to make feedback more dialogic and to invest in formative assessment and maybe reduce the work of summative assessment and shift that time and effort into formative. Now, in terms of academic integrity, I mean, that's a huge topic on its own. So I've just commented briefly here that with generative AI, there's been a big flurry of activity, and no doubt you'll have read stuff and been to talks about this. There's two broad responses that are developing. One is that as academics, we need to get familiar with AI, chat with generative AI, and start to use it ourselves, but also work out in professional fields how AI is influencing the field, how it's influencing practitioners in the field. And we need probably to teach students how to use AI. And that's an aspect of employability, but also of inclusion. And a second part is to move towards more authentic assessments. And Stuart's talk will give you some further in-depth information on that. So I wonder where you are with AI at the moment in your own knowledge and skills, in your knowledge of how it's influencing the field, and how you're working with students with AI. Now, all of these key ideas, and I'm sorry to rush through them so quickly, but I'm sure that many of them are sort of revision for you. So I'm just reminding you really of those ideas. But when we come to change practice, say that in your college, you feel there's work to be done on assessment and feedback. How would you go about that? Well, if there's something absolutely bad happening, some really difficult problem, sure, you can have a top-down management approach to that. But frankly, that kind of approach is unlikely to be very effective if you're trying to move practice forward, if you're trying to improve assessment and feedback more generally. So I propose to you, and the evidence is reasonably clear, that a professional inquiry approach is effective. That's collaborative, generating data, analysing what's going on, making a change and evaluating the impact of that change, a kind of action research approach. And that has been widely used in assessment. For example, and the best example, I think, is Tester. Okay, transforming the experience of students through assessment, and the web link is there. And if you look at Tester, it basically uses some different forms of data generation and analysis to inform the collaborative development of feedback, assessment and feedback practice across, say, a program or across a faculty with several programs. So that's the kind of approach, I think, that I would say is most likely to have a real impact on practice. Okay, so I've skipped through all these different ideas. Don't forget the purposes, the little bit of philosophy at the beginning. Then we've looked at constructive alignment, authentic assessment briefly, variation in grading and all the challenges that brings, transparency, and the idea that you can give the students lots of writing, but in the end, the best thing to do is get some exemplar work and get them to grade it, and then have a big debate with an experienced tutor and discuss why it got that grade, why it deserves such and such a grade, and what feedback you would give. And then the other two ideas there are, they're in the wrong way around, I think. But anyway, academic integrity is where I discussed AI. But dialogic feedback is the idea that you could make the feedback experience more dialogic, more two-way, so that the student has a chance, at least on some of their feedback, to amend their work and improve it in some way. Or you can try and link the feedback from this assignment, say in semester 1, to another assignment that's coming up in semester 2, maybe a similar format of assignment, so that you can say to the student, well, there's your feedback from semester 1. So how are you going to go about differently? How are you going to approach the work differently for semester 2? And finally, then I'd mentioned this idea that if you're leading change that's actually going to stick, that's actually going to work, then you're probably going to have to use a form of collaborative inquiry. Okay, and that's my little talk. The notes that you'll get from a PDF will have all those provocative questions in and a few more questions as well. But I would like to open up for discussion now, and perhaps you'd like to, if you're a bit shy, you can put something on the chat maybe, but to be honest, you can come on the camera and speak to us and comment on your current practice or ask me questions about these ideas. So I'll stop sharing and let's see what questions or comments you have in relation. How do these ideas relate to your practice, could you say?
Thank you so much, Pete. We have a question from Federico. Federico?
Okay, thank you, Federico.
Yes, hi, and thank you so much for the presentation. I might be the wrong person to begin with the Q&A, but I'm going to start anyway. Wrong meaning that my question is slightly tangential, so it might not be 100% relevant to what you've discussed. But while you were talking, I was wondering, I was thinking about collaborative projects, student projects with industry or with charities. Because in that case, there's another layer of complexity, if you like. On top of all the issues you've talked about, there are, of course, potentially conflicting agendas and different ways of assessing priorities, different objectives. So what are your recommendations when it comes to achieving these standards in this slightly more complex type of setting?
Yeah, I think I mean, one of the things we have to accept that when we're working in partnership with employers, with the sector, there's always going to be variation in the student experience, isn't there? So you can't, like, we can come together and do this kind of training, and you can try and influence the practice of your, if you like, your clinical practitioners, the people out there. But there's always going to be considerable variation. So I think that the key there is for the student to be prepared well, so that they can kind of manage that. Because they're going to get, say you've got feedback coming from somebody in the field, they're going to be maybe very focused on a pragmatic issue, whereas you're trying to say, oh, we wanted you to, consider this theoretical framework, in relation to the thing you were doing. Well, I think it's rich. I think it works. I think it will be a little bit, it can be a bit rough for the students in terms of their experience, because they can get different. One of them will be in a lovely, supportive, expansive workplace, and another one will be in a difficult situation where, it's hitting the fan and everybody's focused on getting things done. And so I don't have an easy answer to you, but there's many of us working in partnership like that. I work in my field, I work with schools and colleges, and they vary hugely in what support and feedback they're giving to the students. So I think a bit of guidance and a bit of training for clinical mentors and so on, but in the end I think the student has to manage that and be realistic about it. So that's where students, working on them to become a self-assessor, can be very powerful, right? So they can kind of be a bit more resilient and say, okay, I've just got it in the neck because of something, but I'm gonna try and take a little bit of distance from that as best I can, and I obviously fall back on my tutor, my college tutor, to reassure me. So it's a bit of a messy answer, Federico. It's a good question, and I didn't.
No, thank you. In my experience, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. Some cases have been more easy, let's say easier than others. I agree. It's more pressure on the students and on the supervisors as well. But I think it's enriching. I agree with you. It's very enriching for the students. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amira?
Thank you very much for giving us this short presentation. I really enjoy it. And it's often the philosophy that you started from the beginning is about what's behind the assessment. So my question for you, I just want to know that what's your recommendation based on the what you write formative assessment. If the module is not having the formative assessment, just summative assessment, how we can benefit giving feedback to the student?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to wait for, say, a revalidation to introduce formative assessment, but it can be powerful if you do revalidate with, you know, with a format that says, where is the formative assessment in each module? So that is what actually happens in some universities. They would revalidate, and so that they would have formative assessment, summative assessment, very clear. But in the meantime, you don't have to wait for that, I don't think. So, for example, you know, the typical kind of thing that people might do is they might have a two-part assessment. One is a presentation or a proposal, and then the other part is the finished piece of work. Okay, so for example, you might have a proposal, and it doesn't carry any marks, but then you have a tutorial or group tutorial where the students get a chance to share their proposal, you know, what they're going to do, what they're planning to do for their assignment, and they get some feedback from their peers and from a tutor. It's say in a group tutorial, something like that. And then, so that's an example, and then they go on to do the project and submit it, and they get their summative grade and feedback. So that's all I mean by formative assessment. And sometimes later on you might revalidate to give some credit to that proposal, so that it's actually submitted fairly formally, but they get the feedback on the proposal, so they now got some proper feedback that they can improve the project because of the feedback they've had. I hope that's clear as mud.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any more questions? Tamina?
Sorry, I'm in a shared space, so not turning on my video.
No worries.
I really agreed with the point that, let's say, if we are giving feedback to the summative assessment, where the student has already received the grade for the year, they're not even looking into the feedback most of the time. So your suggestion was really useful in terms of having an exercise where they can see whatever feedback that they received on one point could be reused for another one.
Yeah.
My second point is, let's say I'm a data science and AI person, and you commented on the use of the large language models or the generative AIs, where students are producing quite a bit of their work using these tools because these are available nowadays. Like me as a lecturer, I am sometimes creating some of my content. So let's say previously I would look in various sources to find case studies that would, let's say, if I've covered bits of my theory, I would find out case studies where they could translate whatever they have learned would be applied to real world application. I can somehow tailor like custom use cases for my teaching nowadays using the generative AIs. I'm using the ideas, then expanding it based on real world case studies. So what I suggest my students to, because the tools are there, they're using it, to use it more responsibly to educate themselves better, make their lives easier. But the sources, like the generated content, they need validating whatever they generated. So I'm also teaching my students kind of validate from a, let's say, reliable source, though it has generated something. The way to use it would be to generate their ideas or enhance what they already have, and then go to sources to expand.
Yeah, I mean, I think on this second point about the generative AI, I mean, we're all at different places, and it's very specific to subject discipline to some extent as well. But I mean, I do think it's useful to use AI, try to use AI in an interactive way. So in other words, the other day I was preparing a very concise lit review on deep thinking, right, for a group of researchers, education researchers, and I wanted it was about a 5-page quick review, and of course my review was influenced by what I know. So at the end, I just said to AI, I just designed a prompt for AI and asked it to summarize the key points on deep thinking in the classroom or deep thinking in learning. And it came up with a checklist. And there was one thing that I hadn't Now, I think that's quite a useful way of using AI because I'm interacting with it and I'm presenting my work and getting it to see if there's anything missing in a way or summarize my work, whatever. So I do think that interactive idea is something to work on with the students as well as ourselves. And on
Yeah.
your previous idea, I think on the previous question about the feedback, what you could do if you had the resource, okay, you could make the students gather their feedback from semester one and work on it with a little action plan saying what, so what, here's my feedback from my assignments in semester one, what am I learned from that, and what am I going to take forward? And then if they have to share that with their personal tutor, that can be a really useful group tutorial or individual tutorial, depending on how much resource you've got, to help them, so the tutor actually sees their feedback all in one place and what they've taken from it. So I think that's a very useful model for making summative feedback, which otherwise might be dismissed by the student, actually making it work and getting some money value out of it, because you've spent the time writing it and the student has it, and really they need to interact with it in a practical way, I think, rather than just read it and think, oh yeah, okay, and leave it like that. So I hope that's both questions.
Yeah. It's really useful to hear to this. So let's say because we do have the rubric or the marking criteria, when I'm giving feedback, what I try to do, if the student has lost marks in any space, I'd take the time to write out what would give them the higher grade. So whatever they have done, probably giving a little bit of, let's say, direction, signposting that if you added this, or if this was presented this way.
I think that's great. If you have got rubrics, I mean, I'm all in favour. I don't like mathematical rubrics, but I do like simple rubrics that set out the assessment criteria. I really think they are popular with students and with tutors, because in a way it helps us all to grade more quickly and to grade more effectively, hopefully. And the students do tend to like them. That's the research shows that they're reasonably popular. But I think in a way it's constructing the rubric, and still you have to do, remember on my transparency slide, rubric plus student exemplar plus dialogue leads to evaluative judgment, and the tutors need to do that and the students need to do it. So it's still, even when you've got good rubrics, that's not job done. You've still got to engage with them and have dialogue around a bit of exemplar work. Anyway, listen, I think we're coming to the end of my time now, Antonius, so I probably should say
thank you so much, Pete. I think that Stuart has already joined us. Thank you, Pete, for a lot of food for thought. If we have any more questions, I will gather them and send them to you, and perhaps people can be in touch with you beyond this meeting to have a more interesting discussion.
Sure.
Stuart, are you here?
Yes, I am. I was here for the start. So hello, Pete. Good to see you again. Feeling under pressure following that, but on the plus side, at least we have the same reference for the definition for authentic assessment.
Yeah, and I left it alone for you there. I skipped over that slide, Stuart. I left it alone for you. Off you go.
Thank you.
Over to you, Stuart. I've already introduced you when we started. Stuart is a senior consultant in Advanced HE, and he will talk to us about authentic assessment. Stuart, we have about, 20 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for the invite. Yes, my name is Stuart Norton. I'm a senior consultant in education at Advanced HE. I've been with Advanced HE for 8 years now, but prior to that, I spent 13 years in higher education, lecturing in applied criminology. So I refer to myself as a recovering academic. I do understand some of the pressures and strains that you're going under. I'm also not an assessment expert per se, so under great pressure following the great Professor Pete Boyd in this presentation. But part of my role at Advanced HE is to curate across the whole sector, and some of the work that I've done, and indeed one of the major projects I've led is the update to the Student Success Framework series, of which assessment and feedback forms a major part. And I was co-chair of the recent symposium, and that's where one of your colleagues reached out to me and asked if I would present at this event. So thank you very much for the invite. I'm going to talk around enhancing student success and using authentic assessment as a mechanism for that. But first, what I want to do is just set the scene a little bit. I'm going to talk about positive trajectories, so student futures and employability as a segue into authentic assessment. And I'm going to leave you with a resource that colleagues at the University of Kent have developed in partnership with Advance HE that you may or may not be familiar with. But first, I just want to touch on that context and that strategic importance. This list isn't exhaustive, but I'm sure there are many there that resonate with you and may indeed be a clear catalyst for your involvement in this area and looking at how we can improve mechanisms around student assessment, but also how it can influence students' trajectories thereafter, whether that's to postgraduate research, starting their own business, or indeed into students transitioning into professional jobs. We know that students transition into professional jobs and also into postgraduate study act as key measures of an institution's performance. Whilst that's very nuanced, and whilst employment doesn't equal employability, and whilst there's much wider context to consider, fees, student expectations, social mobility, sustainability, etc., there is a real need for us to consider in how we're operating, and I think it would be remiss not to consider that background. Second to that, we have a range of disruptors right in the middle there. ChatGPT, AI, technology itself has just ended the conversation from Pete. A massive disruptor in terms of higher education. But that's not the only disruptor. Social justice. How can we ensure fair admission process? Should universities make contextual offers? And if so, what are the challenges? Student and staff well-being. A number of areas where students need support in adjusting to campus life, whether that be in relation to mental health, coping with independent living. We also know that there's been a huge rise in the amount of students declaring a disability, and also how we support staff through this. Politics. I've lost count of the number of different ministers of states for universities and prime ministers we've had over the last several years, but there's a huge impact there. Metrics, I'm sure that's something that we're all familiar with. Sustainability, and of course COVID, the nod to the unknown and how that can impact us, and how we had to change our practices, including our assessment practices, pretty much overnight. So a number of these are interlinked, and I think it's we can't always disaggregate what the specific impact is of a certain disruptor, e.g. disaggregating international student numbers from Brexit, from COVID, I think is really, really challenging. But what we are facing is an environment where the higher education sector is under extreme pressure. We see that in the press, we see it in the news, we see it from announcements around the country. And yet, notwithstanding this context, and it is an important context, and these disruptors, ensuring that our graduates have the ability and the capability and the confidence to effectively articulate the skills and attributes that they have, and to be able to apply these in a variety of different settings is of critical importance. And I did want to share just the top 10 skills predicted for 2025. And you'll see here analytical thinking and innovation, complex problem solving, critical thinking, analysis, creativity, originality and initiative, reasoning, problem solving, ideation, flexibility. There are many, if not all, that are going to be present in your programs already. But how we actually identify those, how we test those, how the students understand those in an authentic setting, and how they make those connections are really, really important. And I also think that I just put in a couple of quotes because I just thought this was quite interesting. I've been fortunate enough to do a range of work across the UAE through Advance HE. But this is the UAE Minister for Education. By 2026, we're phasing out traditional degrees. They will all be interdisciplinary. We're talking about social entrepreneurship, business innovation, focusing on the soft skills. So again, a huge nod, I think, to authenticity and different tasks and different ways of looking at curriculum. And this quote here, I don't think is that surprising, really. You know, we're not worried about the hard skills, the tech skills. We need people who have the soft skills in order to engage and collaborate. And that is because if a student graduates from yours or any other institution, I think it's a given that they have the technology, the technical skills and the knowledge as identified by their degree. But it's actually how they can use that. You know, employers aren't necessarily interested in what your students know; they're interested in what they can do with what they know. And I think that is a difference, and I think it is something that we need to consider. For me, I think there's a gap around theory into practice, and I think it's this adapting and contextualizing knowledge where we fall down in the sector as a whole. I think that's the biggest gap, and I also think that it's something that can be addressed by a greater focus on authenticity within assessments. And when I say authentic, I don't specifically necessarily mean directly in relation to work, but I do mean in terms of cognitive challenge, and I will come on to that for you. Just sticking with employability, and the reason why I included this, I saw that you offer, I think it's 95% of your undergraduate programs are offered work placement, and we know that work placements are important, but how are we supporting all students? How are we supporting that other 5%? And actually offering to 95% of students doesn't necessarily mean 95% of students take it up. But this is some data from a project looking at across Wales, and all HE providers in Wales took part in this. And this is from the student survey, and it's their view on whether employability, and that is the skills, values, behaviours, attributes that we've indicated, were coming out from the programme. Now, I've included it because I think it's quite interesting. When placements are compulsory, 69% of students see that there's an emphasis on employability within their programme, compared to 58%, so 11 percentage points different when it's optional, down to 43 percentage points when it's not offered. All of these are statistically significant. You can break that down by discipline, and forgive me because I wasn't familiar with what disciplines were going to be present today, but you can see this across, this is just using the standard codes, but you can see in terms of arts, health and social care, and social science and STEM. I don't want to labour this point too much, but there is other data from the Planning for Success survey that shows that this was old data. The survey's never been repeated, unfortunately, but it does show that at the point of Delhi, which we used to use as our measure of graduate outcomes, if you had an industrial or sandwich placement, 64% were in professional employment, 2 percentage points better than those that had a shorter structured placement, and these were 13 percentage points better that had the non-compulsory placement. And again, this group here, 12 percentage points better here, but it's a huge difference, 27 percentage points between the sandwich placement or 25% between the shorter structured placement. The Planning for Success survey was taken 2 years later, fully weighted survey, just under 4,000 students. And interestingly, there's no statistical difference, no difference in the percentages between the shorter structured placement or that gold standard industry placement. But I think what's really quite important about this is, yes, we know this is the way to affect employment and graduate outcomes in one area, but it's also around the assessment and how we're dealing with that, and also how it is we're supporting students that don't get that opportunity. And for me, that is where assessment and feedback play a major role. I actually think the pandemic had a range of positive changes in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion. And while all assessment practices should account for that, I think it made us stop and take note and consider different practices in a much different light. Authentic assessment itself is broad and an important concept in assessment, and there's a recent literature review. I can provide you links directly to that, but it goes beyond just directly in relation to work placements. It's about simulations, problem-based learning, assessment of group work, e-portfolios, and it's about cognitively looking at not just work, but emotional and ethically challenging work as well, to help students learn how they judge their own performance. And I think there's an opportunity here for colleagues to reimagine assessment, and I think if we think about this in I think if we think about this in terms of policy, We can see that the QA quality code providers design assessments that test appropriate learning outcomes and are fair, reliable, accessible, authentic and inclusive. And indeed, your own good practice guide suggests that there should be authentic assessments. Forgive me, I didn't actually put that in. There's actually a section on there, which I'm sure you're familiar with anyway, that says authentic assessment, creating assignments and exam questions that focus on personal reflection and self-evaluation, challenge the students to answer open-ended questions about their learning, and questions and require students to explain, analyze, infer, create, compose, evaluate, and authentically demonstrate their mastery of module content. So we know it's important, but I think we also just need to take a slight step back and define assessment. You know, what is it we actually mean when we're talking about assessment? And some definitions of assessment focus much more on summative assessment, and that is seeing it as a process by which academics assure academic standards. But assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning offers more evidence of effectiveness within the literature. So assessment is when students do something that they and others can observe and draw some conclusions about. And thus assessment is defined broadly in this way, can occur anywhere in that instructional cycle. It can be written, verbal, individual or group based, and it can be as small as answering a question in a seminar or as big as a year-long research project. So it can count towards a student mark, or it might not. So when we think of student activity, it's about designing for students to do something and have opportunities to have that feedback on that activity, whether from a computer, from peers, or from a client, or from themselves, or possibly from you, represents this definition in practice. And so, using the example from Villarreal and authentic assessment, and one way to think about this is in terms of its authenticity. Authentic assessments should be challenging, they should offer real-world application, and they should develop evaluative judgment. Authenticity has been identified as a key characteristic of assessment design, which promotes learning authentic assessment and aims to replicate the tasks and performance standards typically found in the world of work. Now, firstly, it's found to have had a positive impact on student learning. Secondly, it helps them solve problem skills, promotes autonomy, enhances motivation, provides opportunities for students to self-regulate and develop metacognition. And these sort of areas are highly related with employability. But when it comes to challenging, cognitive challenge has been emphasised. So we can also consider situations that involve emotional or ethical challenges, as well as cognitive challenge to be authentic assessment. Now, normally what tends to happen is that we do emphasise employment context within our programmes. And I know I started by focusing on employment and employability, but it can refer to any real world activity. And this opens up the possibility of connecting to larger issues such as sustainability, social justice, that they may not be necessarily foregrounded in any particular career, but which require the application of that higher education knowledge and skills, which students, in areas which students are very concerned about. And thirdly, authentic assessment helps students develop an understanding of what constitutes quality in a field and grows their ability to make that judgment about their own and others' work. Now, one way that you could suggest that you could operationalize this is through the learning principles checklist, which you may be familiar with. George Kerr and O'Donnell from 2013. And this provides a useful way for us to consider the extent to which any given assessment or feedback practice promotes learning. I think it's helpful to think about this in terms of underlying learning principles, because it helps us to categorize different practice and critiques the practice and the research based on them, and helps us to explain the effects of various particular assessment practices. So these principles here on the screen define what Kerr and O'Donnell in the US refer to as high impact practices. So one can engage in authentic assessment without incorporating all of these principles. And therefore that actually makes it easier to implement it in many different modules, across a program of study, have a programmatic approach to authentic assessment. So when assessing or given any assessment activity, I would encourage colleagues to ask yourself these questions that are on the screen right now. Now, I wanted to give an example, and I think in some ways it is easier in certain subjects, but I wanted to give an example of authentic assessment from my own experience. And what we have on the screen here is a custody suite and also a classroom that's been set up to deal with a crime scene. And it's an authentic assessment task, and as much as the students know the policies, they know the procedure, they know the law in advance, but what actually happens is they go into an unknown environment where it's a bit messy. There's multiple different options for them to go through. So students will go through a simulated crime scene and assume the role of an investigator, in which they're required to solve a real world crime. And there's a range of real world problems in terms of forensic analysis, the real relevance in that classroom is to induce that sense of suspense, intrigue, help students hone and identify their skills, what chemicals they need to use, what powders they need to use, what fluids or hair has been left behind. So quite often there's an ill-defined problem that's open to multiple interpretations rather than just setting an assessment. And students are required to follow those structured investigative steps that they have been previously discussed and taught in class. But the reconstruction presents them with they're not limited to any form of expected response. That creativity in undertaking their assessment. And so they undertake the analysis, they make sure they've got the correct information, and ultimately they can then compare and conclude their case. So the takeaway, I think, really is that the simulation mimics complex real-life situations that engage the students in practical tasks and motivates them to try different alternatives to solve problems. So it's a synergy between the content and the theory that happens in the class and the application that actually makes it channeling towards that real-world setting, which students may, for example, if they choose to go on and become a crime scene investigator. Now, there will be other examples, I can share from the recent symposium differences in biology, law, etc. Depending on student colleagues' interests, we can find those examples for you. But I did just want to flag that as an example. I also wanted to touch on the NSS because that was something that came up at the start in terms of the context, and also in terms of you'll see some synergies with Pete's talk in terms of criteria and feedback as well. We know there's two questions within the NSS that relate to assessment or around the criteria and the marking of assessment. I just wanted to flesh those out a little bit and how these metrics can be woven into the teaching experience and also how it relates to authentic assessment as well. So I wanted to focus here really on, is this clear in advance when we're talking about assessment criteria? Quite often the practice is that we have our assessment criteria, we put it onto the VLE, and the question is, will our students engage with this? Now, technically, we've put it on the VLE, it's available in advance, but that focus on the word clear is important, and how students might understand clear and what others think that actually means. So we could suggest that we work with this and that we get students to actually actively work with the criteria. Pete was talking about working through this with students and also that calibration with staff. And we can do that in a number of ways. We can get them to understand the criteria by working through the rubrics, so we can explain the marking of the rubrics to them. We could do videos or screencast opportunities to get students to understand how criteria operates within, for example, a piece of work as we mark it. How we explain how that criteria maps onto a particular element within that work, and we can get them to work through examples in class where they're actually asked to apply the criteria to pieces of work that they or previous students have completed. So they get a greater understanding of that marking process. And I think it's important because they start to realize then how we mark and how it's fair and how it's rigorous and how it's woven into the fabric of the way that we operate. So in a sense, we're demystifying that process about what happens and how student work, once it gets submitted, what actually happens next. And I also think there's some guiding questions around this. I think we need to think what we're doing in terms of assessment. And again, I know you're doing this already, so it's not, I'm suggesting you're not doing it, but I think it's helpful just to come back and touch upon some of these points. We want things to be valid in terms of actually assessing the learning objectives, and we'll have that assessment, checking that assessment and making sure that we articulate that to our students is important. We want things to be fair. making sure that the students understand that once they submit the work, those learning outcomes, how it actually all ties together. And in terms of fairness, I mentioned before about the criteria and understanding the marking process, but also explain to them about the rigor and how we mark. And how those processes exist outside of the first marker in terms of second marker and external examiner involvement as well. And I think that understanding for students might help them realise that assessment is reliable. You know, we are looking to calibrate that, and we have second markers that enable that process and check that process. And we, you know, especially when you've got a number of people involved in marking on a module or program teams, you know, getting everyone to readily understand that criteria and go through that calibration process is important. And lastly, as I've mentioned, you know, that authenticity, you know, there's an opportunity there to think about this in a more practical way. I'm very conscious of time, but I did want to touch upon the fact that, you know, this is all great, but what is the how-to? And you will have these slides, but if colleagues have a device, you can take that QR code, and that will take you through to the assessment and feedback superchargers written by Pitt and Quinlan from the University of Kent. And this is a game-based resource to take you through how to supercharge your assessment. So Supercharge itself contains 8 decks, and each one of these addresses the 8 principles on how to enrich learning in higher education. And these key principles are what you can see on the screen there, from higher expectations all the way through to reflection. And these are based on Koo and O'Donnell that I'd mentioned earlier, but also on the literature review by Pitt and Quinlan. And they argue that designing assessment and feedback in alignment with these principles will supercharge those practices, creating higher impact on student learning. And I think gameplay is really important because you know, we can learn much more through learning fun. You can take this through with your students if you want, and they've written, and it's in there and it's freely available, problem-based scenarios. You know, it's a fun interactive way for you to work through it, looking at 4 scenarios around improving nutrition, improving NSS, preparing students for life after university, and integrating international students onto postgraduate programs as well. Very conscious of time, so there's a picture of the card. I did want to end with a with an anecdote. And you may or may not be familiar with this essay, Angels on a Pin, but this is in an American university where a lecturer is asked to second mark a piece of assessment because a student had claimed he should have got a top marks, and the lecturer felt that the student shouldn't have got any marks. And the problem was this. The question was, show me how it's possible to determine the height of a tall building with the aid of barometer. And the student had answered, take a barometer to the top of the building, attach a long rope to it, lower the barometer to the street, and then bring it up. You measure the length of the rope, and the length of the rope is the height of the building. Arguably, the student had a good case for full credit. However, the student was on a physics course, and full credit was supposed to certify competency in physics. So he said to the other instructor, would you be happy for him to resit the question? The instructor said yes. He said he was more surprised when the student also agreed to this. So he gave the student 6 minutes, gave him a pen and paper, and said, answer the question. After 5 minutes, the student hadn't written anything, and he said, do you want to give up? And he said, no, not at all. Actually, there's many ways to answer the question. I'm just trying to think which one I'd like to give you. So he scribbled down this formula here. And he said, you take the barometer to the top of the building, you lean over the edge, you drop the barometer, timing it with a stopwatch, and then using this formula, you can calculate the height of the building. At this point, he asked his colleague if he would give up, and he said he conceded and he would, and they awarded him nearly full marks. He asked the student for any other ways of measuring the height of the building, and he gave them several, including taking it out on a sunny day, measuring the height of the shadow, comparing it to the height of the shadow of the building. But my favourite one was to knock on the door of the caretaker and say, sir, you have a fine building, I have a fine barometer. You tell me how tall your building is, and you can have this barometer. And the point was that the student had said that he was tired and pedantic and fed up being told how to talk, how to think, and actually he wanted to have that better understanding of the deep inner logic of the subject and creativity. And it made me smile when Pete started by saying, how do we allow for creativity in assessment? Do we allow it? And knowing that that's how I was going to end, I just thought it made me smile. You will have these. That's the latest case studies on from our symposium from assessment. As I say, I'm a bit of a fraud. I edit them. I don't actually write them. And there is also a QR code to the most recent and updated Student Success Framework series. And for colleagues interested in inclusive learning and teaching, our inclusive literature review was published this morning. So you'll be able to find that online, or I can drop a link if anyone's really interested into the chat. I'm going to stop there. I hope that was helpful and of interest to colleagues. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for the very rich and fun presentation. We have perhaps time for a couple of short questions. If anybody wants to ask Stuart a question. I have one, if nobody else has one ready. Stuart, you mentioned about authentic assessments and the real world scenario and so on. Can you explain the difference to us between authentic and work-based? And is the work-based by default authentic, or does it need to make sure that it fulfills all the other criteria in some way?
Yeah, I think there's several criteria there to make something authentic. The work-based, if it's directly related to the work, is going to meet the criteria of it being authentic by its nature. But I think we need to think much more broader around authentic assessment in terms of the challenge that it poses. So it doesn't necessarily have to relate directly to the world of work, and I think that just opens up the door for you know, if you're teaching history, you say, well, what's an authentic assessment? Perhaps we could take an example where we change something that happened in history and get students to explore what the effects may have been from that. You know, and I think that creates that authentic challenge and starts relating it to the real world, rather than just you are in a work-based environment, identify the correct the correct measures for helping this student, helping this person, you know, improve in terms of medicine or whatever it may be. I think if you are doing work, you know, for me, work integrated learning is really, really broad. And I think we need to think about that in terms of capstone projects. I think we need to think about it in terms of case studies. For me, a really important part is reflection and teaching people to reflect. I think that's something that we do need to keep in mind. But yeah, it's certainly broader. I would refer to the works of Villarreal. I would actually refer colleagues to the assessment and feedback superchargers. There's a whole section in there on authentic and real world problems, and that draws directly back to the literature over the last 5 years. So you can follow that through. I hope that helps answer that.
Thank you, Stuart. And a last question from Edward.
Yes, I have just one question because can you hear me?
Yes.
China, our T&E campus in China. I just wonder, is there any other some kind of like training courses for staff? I mean, that can be run to our colleagues here that are based at overseas.
I'm not a salesperson, but assessment and feedback superchargers is actually something that is freely available as a resource, so anyone can download it as long as you're a member of Advanced HE. But we also run it as an open or a bespoke program. So colleagues can either attend an event. There's going to be, as in a meeting yesterday, there's going to be one next year here in the UK, but it can also be delivered virtually, and it can also be delivered in person, so bespoke, so a university can pay for that. So that would either be delivered by our own staff, or indeed Ed Pitt and Kathleen M. Quinlan are also our associates who deliver work for us, and would always be first refusal in delivering that. So they do actually run a workshop for you. I haven't got the list. I haven't got the link prepared but I will drop it into the chat, and you can then. Let me just.
Sure, thank you. Just in case in the future there's a need for us, then I'll contact you. Would that be all right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Please do feel free. As I say, I didn't come prepared to promote different things we do, but there should somewhere. I'm finding it hard to find it. So I can understand why colleagues may not be able to find it. Here we go. Register your interest. I'm sure it's this one.
You can send us, Stuart, any resources, and we can upload them after the presentation, and we can upload them on our websites for people to access. We're out of time, so I worry that people might have to go to other meetings. Thank you so much to our esteemed guests. Samira, you want to make an announcement about our next event?
Yeah, I would like to thank the speakers and thank everyone who attended this seminar. Can you please add to your calendar the next seminar for AEN group will be on 12th of December, Thursday, 2 to 3. And more details will come later with the invitation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to everyone who joined. Have a lovely afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.